I stood in the absolute darkest corner of the grand ballroom, listening to over 250 elegantly dressed guests roar with unhinged laughter as my sister, Cassidy, called me a worthless cow on the microphone. None of the people in that room, not the bridesmaids frantically recording the humiliation on their smartphones, not my parents nodding along in smug agreement from the head table, and certainly not the groom, Julian, raising his expensive glass of whiskey, knew the truth. They did not know that in exactly 72 hours, the financial press would announce my name as the new regional CEO of the multi-billion-dollar corporate group that had just quietly acquired Julian's company. When Julian finally looked at me, really looked at me, and realized who I was and what I held in my hands, his face went the color of wet ash. My revenge was not a screaming match in the middle of a dance floor, nor was it a tearful dramatic toast. It was a secret of money, corporate fraud, and a brutal reckoning hidden for over 30 years. But to understand how we got to that explosive moment, you have to understand the room we were standing in. My name is Valerie. At 36 years old, I had mastered the absolute perfect art of becoming completely invisible. I was currently doing my very best to dissolve into the heavy velvet curtains of the west wing of the Willow Ridge estate. It was a wedding venue so spectacularly pretentious that the air conditioning literally smelled like lavender and old money. From my vantage point near the kitchen service doors, where the waiters rushed in and out with trays, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive crowd. They were currently drinking the vintage champagne I had secretly paid for, eating the filet mignon I had quietly upgraded from the standard chicken option, and staring adoringly at my younger sister, Cassidy. The wedding had cost nearly $200,000. That is a staggering, sickening amount of money to spend on a single evening of vanity. A significant portion of that sum, specifically the extra $50,000 required to secure this specific luxury venue on a Saturday night and the premium, top-tier open bar, had quietly left my personal bank account 6 months ago. Yet as I stood there in my tailored understated navy blue dress, clutching a glass of sparkling water, I was not treated like the benevolent benefactor who made this entire circus possible. I was the stain on the beautiful scenery. I was the ugly secret they had to invite out of biological obligation. Cassidy stood on the elevated stage, the bright spotlight catching the thousands of hand-sewn crystals on her custom designer gown. She looked beautiful. She always did. It was her singular superpower, the one thing that had allowed her to glide through 30 years of life without ever really having to work for a single thing. Beside the stage, the DJ lowered the volume of the soft jazz track, signaling that the speeches were transitioning from the sentimental tears to the interactive entertainment. I looked past Cassidy and spotted Julian, her brand new husband. Julian was a director of finance at a mid-sized consulting firm in Denver. He looked flushed, happy, and entirely too confident, holding a tumbler of dark, expensive whiskey. He had that easy, arrogant charm of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He had absolutely no idea that the room he was currently standing in was built on a massive foundation of stolen corporate funds. He had no idea that the towering floral centerpieces, the dramatic lighting rigs, and the crystal glasses his friends were drinking from were all paid for by his own gross professional negligence and outright criminal fraud. And most importantly, as he laughed and loosened his silk tie, he had no idea that the quiet, slightly overweight sister-in-law standing by the kitchen doors was the exact person who now owned his entire professional existence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I did not look at the floral arrangements as pretty decorations. I saw them as glaring line items on a forensic audit report. $18,000 for imported white orchids. $9,000 for the beverage service upgrade. Everywhere I looked, I did not see a celebration of eternal love. I saw an active crime scene. I saw my own money, and the money of my corporate shareholders transformed into a theater of pure vanity for two people who thought they were entirely untouchable. The music faded out completely. The room fell dead quiet. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. Cassidy gripped the microphone with both hands. Her knuckles were stark white, and her face was heavily flushed with a third or fourth glass of vintage rosé she had consumed in the last hour. She scanned the massive room, her eyes deliberately skipping over her new husband's wealthy family, skipping over our parents who were beaming with pride, until they locked onto me in the back corner. A smile curled on her lips. It was not a kind, sisterly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had found a wounded, defenseless animal trapped in a cage. "You know," Cassidy announced, her voice amplified to a boom that rattled the crystal glasses on the tables. "I have to give a special huge shout-out to my big sister Valerie. Where are you, Val?" Hiding by the buffet again, checking to see if they brought out more bread rolls. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the room. I felt the heat rise up the back of my neck, a familiar burn of shame, but I did not move an inch. I kept my spine completely rigidly straight. It was a physical habit drilled into me by years of surviving brutal corporate boardrooms and hostile negotiations. Even if my family only saw me as a slouching, depressed failure. We really have to thank her, Cassidy continued, pacing the stage like a stand-up comedian working a very easy, intoxicated crowd. Our parents insisted we invite her today. You know how it is. You need to have the full set for the photos. You need the beauty. She gestured to herself dramatically, pausing for the crowd to cheer and whistle. And you desperately need the beast. The laughter grew significantly louder. It was a physical weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. I am kidding. I am kidding. Calm down, Cassidy laughed, though her eyes were dead cold and entirely fixed on me. But seriously, look at her. We used to tell her she was just big-boned when we were kids. But I think she has just grown into a worthless cow now, haven't you, Val? Older, heavy, totally single, and just taking up so much space. But hey, every family needs a pathetic cautionary tale, right? Keeps the rest of us motivated to hit the gym and actually try in life. The room completely erupted. It was not a polite, uncomfortable titter, it was a roar. 250 people, fueled by the free alcohol I had paid for, and the primal thrill of mob mentality, were cackling at my absolute expense. To my left, I saw a table of Cassidy's bridesmaids. 3 of them had their phones out, held high in the air. I saw the distinct bright interface of TikTok on their screens. They were zooming in on my face. They were capturing my public humiliation in high definition to broadcast to the internet. I stood there, and for 5 seconds I felt like I was being flayed alive. The words cut deep, reopening deep. Ugly wounds that had started bleeding when I was a child and had never really scabbed over. They saw a woman in a dark dress standing alone, absorbing the emotional abuse. They saw the family ghost. They saw a convenient scapegoat. They saw the fat, pathetic older sister. But they did not see the monster. They did not see the woman who had been meticulously planning this moment for 14 years. They did not see the woman who had just been appointed the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporate group. They did not see the woman who, 3 weeks prior, had uncovered a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate fraud scheme at her new brother-in-law's company. They saw a victim. They saw a punchline. They saw a moment of cheap entertainment, and they were completely, blissfully oblivious to the fact that the monster was keeping a very detailed, ironclad ledger of every single slight, every stolen dollar, and every insult. 3 weeks before I stood in the corner of that wedding ballroom being called a worthless cow by my sister, I was sitting in the living room of my penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay in Seattle. The time on my laptop screen read 2:00 in the morning. Outside, the city was asleep, a dark, glittering tapestry of rain-streaked streets and distant harbor lights shining through the fog. But inside my living room, the air was crackling with the silent electric hum of a career-defining moment. I sat in my expensive ergonomic chair, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, and refreshed my secure work inbox for the 100th time that night. And finally, at exactly 2:15, there it was. The email was from the chairman of the board of directors at Northbridge Capital Systems. The subject line was deceptively boring. Standard corporate speak. Board Resolution 402B regarding regional leadership structure. I clicked it open. My heart did not race. It actually slowed down to a steady, rhythmic, incredibly calm thump. It was the calm, terrifying focus of a sniper who had finally lined up the perfect, impossible shot after waiting in the freezing brush for 14 years. The email was brief and highly official. It stated that effective the 1st of the following month, I was officially appointed as the new Regional Chief Executive Officer for the Western Division. I leaned back, the premium leather of the chair creaking softly in the total silence of the $4 million apartment I had bought entirely with my own money. I let out a long breath I felt like I had been holding since I was 18 years old, standing in that local bank. I had done it. I had reached the absolute, undeniable top of the corporate food chain. I was holding a job that came with a massive 7-figure base salary and stock options that could literally buy my parents' cheerful yellow house 100 times over. I stood up, walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window, and pressed my palm against the cool pane. The Seattle rain streamed down the glass, blurring the city lights into golden smears. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass. I looked tired. There were deep, dark circles under my eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could completely hide. The toll of 14 years of relentless grinding was etched into my face. Human instinct dictates that when you achieve the greatest, most monumental victory of your entire life, you desperately want to call someone. You want to share the joy. I looked at my phone lying face down on the marble kitchen island. Who would I call? If I called my mother, Brenda would probably interrupt me mid-sentence to complain about the rising cost of Cassidy's wedding flower arrangements, or ask if I had remembered to send the check for the bridal shower gift. If I called my father, Richard would likely ask if the new CEO job came with better health insurance, Because he was thinking of switching his own providers and wanted me to pay his premiums. They wouldn't say congratulations. They would just calculate how they could extract the new wealth. I realized then, standing entirely alone in the dark, that massive success is an incredibly quiet, almost brutal experience when you are the family ghost. There is no applause. There is no popping of champagne corks or warm hugs. There is just the sound of the rain hitting the thick glass and the low mechanical hum of the luxury refrigerator. I turned away from the window. Sentimentality was highly inefficient and I had no room for it anymore. I had serious work to do. Along with the appointment email, the board had sent over a secure digital link to the transition and acquisition data room. Northbridge had just finalized the paperwork to close a massive deal on a mid-sized firm based in Denver called Helios Ledger Consulting. As the incoming CEO, it was my immediate primary job to clean house. My reputation in the industry was not nice. They called me the scalpel. I was the executive they sent in to cut out the financial rot, fire the dead weight, streamline bloated operations, and integrate the newly acquired asset into the massive Northbridge machine. I sat back down at my desk, poured a fresh cup of black coffee, and logged into the highly secure server. I clicked on the folder labeled Helios Financials. I had absolutely no idea that opening those specific digital files would ignite a bomb that would obliterate my family's entire existence. I just thought I was doing my job. I sat in the quiet glow of my laptop screen, the Seattle rain continuing its steady drumming against the glass. The Helios Ledger Consulting acquisition was a massive move for Northbridge Capital. It was a strategic play to dominate the regional market, which meant the data room I had just been granted access to contained thousands of highly confidential files. I started opening folders. Human resources, legal compliance, operational overhead, and finally internal audit reports. I knew, of course, that my brand new brother-in-law, Julian, worked at Helios. It was one of the primary reasons I had deliberately kept my distance from the early acquisition talks, officially recusing myself to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. But now that the ink was dry and the deal was fully closed, the conflict was entirely gone. Now he was just personnel. Now he was under my direct jurisdiction. I clicked on the Human Resources organizational chart. I scrolled down the long list of corporate names, my eyes scanning for the senior leadership team of Helios. There he was, Julian Porter, Director of Finance. I clicked on his name, and a cascade of documents opened. His employment contract, salary history, performance reviews, and then a subfolder labeled Special Projects. I opened it. Inside were files detailing a series of complex, highly irregular financial transactions. These weren't just sloppy accounting. This was a deliberate, sophisticated scheme to siphon funds from client accounts and inflate company profits, all to secure larger bonuses for a select group of executives. Julian was at the center of it. The evidence was irrefutable, meticulously documented, and damning. He had been using his position to enrich himself and others, all while maintaining the facade of a successful, upstanding professional. The wedding, the expensive venue, Cassidy's designer gown, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a lavish display of wealth. It was a celebration funded by fraud. The next few weeks were a blur of intense, focused work. I assembled my team, a small, highly specialized group of forensic accountants and legal experts. We worked in absolute secrecy, piecing together every detail of Julian's scheme. The scale of it was breathtaking, involving shell corporations, offshore accounts, and manipulated financial statements. My team nicknamed it the Helios Heist. We built an airtight case preparing for the inevitable legal battle. This wasn't just about corporate cleanup anymore. It was about justice. And it was personal. The day after the wedding, I initiated the formal acquisition integration process. My first official act as CEO was to call an emergency board meeting for Helios Ledger Consulting. Julian, still basking in his wedding glow, arrived late, radiating a familiar arrogance. He had no idea what was coming. I sat at the head of the conference table, a stack of legal documents neatly arranged in front of me. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the other board members looking nervous and confused. "Good morning, gentlemen," I began, my voice calm and steady. "As you know, Northbridge Capital Systems has officially acquired Helios Ledger Consulting. As the new regional CEO, my first priority is to ensure the integrity and ethical operation of this new asset." I paused, letting my words hang in the air. "To that end, we have conducted an immediate, thorough forensic audit of Helios's financial records." Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "An audit? That's your procedure, I suppose. I assure you our books are in order." I met his gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. "Are they, Julian? Because our audit has uncovered some rather alarming discrepancies. Discrepancies that point to a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme involving the systematic misappropriation of client funds." The color drained from his face. The other board members gasped, whispering amongst themselves. I pulled out a thick binder and slid it across the table. This binder contains irrefutable evidence. Bank statements, email correspondence, forged documents, all pointing to one individual as the architect of this scheme. I opened the binder to a specific page, revealing a blown-up image of Julian's signature on a fraudulent transfer document. Julian Porter, Director of Finance, he stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. I've been framed. Framed? I raised an eyebrow. By whom? The evidence is overwhelming, Julian. And it's not just financial. We have sworn affidavits from employees who were coerced into participating, and others who reported your activities to internal channels, only to be ignored. He looked around the room, desperate, his eyes finally landing on me. The recognition dawned, slowly at first, then with a sickening jolt. His jaw dropped. Valerie, you're the new CEO? That's correct, Julian, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. And as your new CEO, I have a responsibility to our shareholders, our clients, and our employees to ensure that justice is served. You will be immediately suspended without pay. Our legal team will be contacting federal authorities, and you will be facing criminal charges. The room erupted. Julian began shouting, denying everything, but his words were drowned out by the shocked murmurs of the other board members. He was escorted out by security, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The humiliation was exquisite. It wasn't just the loss of his job or his freedom. It was the public unraveling of his carefully constructed life, orchestrated by the very woman he had allowed his wife to publicly mock. The fallout was swift and devastating. News of Julian's arrest and the fraud scandal rocked the local business community. Cassidy, initially furious and in denial, quickly found herself embroiled in the legal aftermath. My parents, who had always championed Cassidy as their golden child, were now facing the harsh reality of their son-in-law's crimes and the potential legal repercussions for their daughter. 6 months later, I returned to my parents' house, the cheerful yellow house I had always felt like an outsider in. Cassidy was waiting for me alone in the living room. My parents were not there. I had insisted through my high-priced corporate lawyers that this final meeting be strictly between the two of us. The house was dead quiet. I sat down at the dining room table, the exact same table where I had been told to be less selfish 18 years ago. I placed a thick, bound legal document in front of Cassidy. She looked absolutely ruined. She was wearing an oversized gray tracksuit, no makeup, and her eyes were swollen, nearly shut from crying. The bravado of the bride was completely gone. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a dull, raspy whisper. "It is a financial restructuring agreement," I said calmly. "But before you sign it, I have 2 things to show you." I pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten letter. My lawyer had found it buried deep in the archived files of the county probate court. "This is a letter from our grandmother," I said. "She wrote it to the executive of her estate the week before she died. Read it." Cassidy took the paper, her hands shaking violently. I watched her eyes scan the cursive handwriting. I knew the words by heart. "Ensure this trust is ironclad. Valerie's the only one in that house who sees the world clearly. Her parents overlook her. Her sister is being raised to be a useless showpiece. I want this money to be Valerie's shield against them." Cassidy made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She dropped the letter. "They knew," she whispered. "Mom and Dad knew she wanted it for you and they took it. They took it because they decided you were the better financial bet," I said flatly. "They invested in the show pony. But that bet failed, Cassidy. The money is gone. Your new house is going to be seized by the bank. The cars are gone, but it gets worse." I pulled out the stack of printed emails from Julian, the ones he had proudly handed over to my committee to save himself. I slid them across the table. "Read what your husband thinks of you," I said. She read the emails. She read how he called her a manipulator, how he claimed she forced him to commit fraud, how he offered to testify against her in federal court if they let him walk free. I watched the last remaining pillar of her perfect, entitled life shatter into 1,000 pieces of transactional reality. "He sold me out," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "He did," I agreed, feeling absolutely no pity. "He is going to federal prison, Cassidy. But you don't have to. If you sign this document, you transfer your equity in this house, Mom and Dad's house, which they bought with my stolen money, directly to me. In exchange, Northbridge will not pursue you as a criminal co-conspirator. You will owe me the money personally. You will pay me back slowly from your own minimum wage earnings. No interest, just the principal." She looked at the walls of the yellow house. She looked at the photos on the mantelpiece, the shrine to her own childhood perfection. Then she looked at me for the very first time in her entire life. She did not look at me like a rival or a bank account. She looked at me like a human being. She picked up the pen and she signed the paper. She signed away the house. She signed away her parents' retirement. She signed away her illusion of being the golden child. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse in Seattle. The rain was falling in soft sheets. I held my phone in my hand, looking at an official email from the district attorney's office. Julian Porter had pleaded guilty to wire fraud. He was sentenced to 36 months into federal penitentiary. His career was permanently over. I swiped to the next notification. It was a bank transfer receipt from Cassidy, $200. Attached was a note. Started my shift at the coffee shop. Feet hurt. Here is the first payment. I smiled, taking a sip of my dark coffee. It would take her 40 years to pay me back at that rate. But I genuinely did not care about the money anymore. She was finally standing on her own feet. I hadn't spoken to my parents in 6 months. They were living in a tiny, cramped apartment, absolutely furious that their retirement plan had completely cut them off. I looked out at the glittering city lights. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing Julian go to jail in an orange jumpsuit. It wasn't seeing Cassidy working a brutal retail job. It wasn't about the punishment at all. It was about the exit velocity. I had completely escaped. I wasn't the scapegoat anymore. I wasn't the glass child. I wasn't the worthless cow. I was Valerie, and I was finally entirely free. I walked off their stage, stepped out of their shadow, and I never, ever looked back.